I need to start by saying I'm not a guy who believes in anything. No ghosts, no God, no karma, nothing. I'm an electrician. I deal in things that either conduct or they don't. So when I tell you what happened over the 6 weeks I lived on Larkspur Hollow Road outside Coos County, Oregon, I want you to understand that I fought every single one of my instincts telling me something was wrong. Because admitting that would have meant admitting I'd lost my mind, and I'd already lost enough that year. The divorce was finalized in March. By April, I'd sold the house in Eugene, split the furniture with Danielle down to the dish towels, and taken a contract job rewiring an old cannery 2 counties over. I needed somewhere cheap and somewhere quiet, and a guy at the job site mentioned his aunt was renting out a house on Larkspur Hollow for $600 a month because, in his words, nobody wants to live way out there. I should have asked him what he meant by that. I didn't. $600 a month sounded like a miracle. The house itself was fine, a little run-down, single-story, green shingle siding gone gray with moss. But the wiring was solid and the roof didn't leak, which is more than I can say for some places I've worked on. It sat at the end of a gravel road with only one other house in sight, about 400 feet down the slope, half swallowed by Douglas firs. That was the Auberlay place. I want to be fair to Mrs. Auberlay because for the first 2 weeks I genuinely thought she was just a normal old woman who kept to herself, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'd catch glimpses of her sometimes, out past the tree line, standing on her porch. She never waved first. I always waved first, the way you do with a neighbor, and she'd sort of tip her head in return, like she was deciding whether I deserved a full wave. I never once saw her during the day when it was dry out, never at the mailbox in sunlight, never in her garden, never walking to her car, because as far as I could tell, she didn't have a car. It was always overcast days or the tail end of a drizzle or full-on downpour that she'd be out there, standing, sometimes just standing at the edge of her yard facing my house. The guy at work, Robbie, his aunt owned a property, and when I mentioned the neighbor to him, he got quiet for a second and then said, "Oh yeah, Betty Ann, she's harmless, just keeps odd hours." I asked him how long she'd lived there, and he said as long as he can remember, and his mom used to tell him not to go past the fence line as a kid. I laughed it off. Every small town's got a house like that. The first strange thing wasn't even about her. It was about the porch. My rental had this old wraparound porch, the kind with lattice skirting around the bottom to keep animals out from under the house. About 10 days in, I was doing a walk around because I heard a scraping noise under the floorboards at night. Figured raccoons, and I noticed a section of the lattice had been pried loose and re-nailed, badly, like someone had gone under there and come back out and tried to disguise it. The nails were newer than the rest, still had bright metal showing at the heads. I didn't think much of it at the time. Landlord stuff, maybe pest control had been under there before I moved in. That night, it rained, the first real rain since I'd moved in. One of those long, steady Oregon rains that doesn't stop for 2 days. Around 11, I got up for water and glanced out my kitchen window toward the tree line, and Mrs. Auberlay was standing in my yard, not hers, mine. Maybe 30 feet from my porch, just standing there in a raincoat with the hood down, letting the water run over her gray hair, staring at the house. I'll be honest, my heart about stopped. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go out there, and I didn't want to just watch her either. So I turned on my porch light, thinking that would signal I saw her, maybe embarrass her to leaving. She didn't move. She stood there another full minute, water pouring down her face, expression completely flat, before she turned and walked back down the slope toward her house, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I told myself she was probably a little senile, wandering at night, and that I should mention it to Robbie or maybe even to her gently the next time I saw her. I almost convinced myself of that. Then my dog died. I had a blue heeler named Cooper, 13 years old, arthritic, slept in a bed by the wood stove, and did not go outside at night because his hips couldn't manage the porch steps. I found him the next morning at the bottom of the porch steps, in the mud, dead, with his back legs looking like they'd been dragged, not walked. The vet in town, a blunt old guy named Halverson, said it looked like heart failure, that old dogs just go sometimes, and that yeah, sometimes they crawl outside first because animals seem to know. I wanted to believe him, but Cooper hadn't been able to manage those steps on his own in over a year, and there was no way he crawled down them by himself. I buried him in the yard, and I'll admit, that's when I started locking the doors at night, which I never used to do out there. For about 10 days after that, nothing happened. It didn't rain. I saw Mrs. Auberlay twice, both times through my window, both times standing at the edge of her own yard rather than mine, and I told myself the whole thing with Cooper was just me being paranoid, that grief does that to a person, makes you look for a shape to put it on. I almost had myself talked all the way down. Then the rain came back, a real system moving in off the coast, and it didn't let up for 4 straight days, and every single one of those nights I'd wake up around the same time, a little after 11, like something set an alarm in me, and every time I looked out she'd be there, closer each night, first the tree line, then the yard, then on the third night at the bottom of my porch steps, looking straight up at my window, and I swear to you her eyes found me even though the room was dark, and I hadn't moved the curtain more than an inch. I called Robbie the next day and asked him straight out if there was something wrong with his aunt's neighbor, and he laughed nervously and said, "Everybody in the hollow's a little odd, man. That's why my aunt rents the place so cheap. Some people won't live out there." I pushed him, and he finally told me something his mother used to say, which was that Betty Ann Auberlay had a daughter once, a long time ago, before Robbie was even born, and the daughter disappeared during a bad storm season sometime in the 80s, and Betty Ann never accepted it, never had a funeral, and some of the old-timers used to say she still went out looking on rainy nights because that's the kind of weather the girl went missing in. That should have made me feel sorry for her instead of scared. And for about an hour, it did. I sat with that story and felt genuinely bad for an old woman who'd lost a child and never gotten to grieve properly. But then I thought about Cooper's back legs and the lattice nailed back up under my porch with bright new nail heads, and the fact that she was getting closer to my house each rainy night like she was working up to something, and the sympathy didn't quite cover the fear. I decided to check under the porch. I want to be clear that this was a stupid decision, and I knew it was stupid while I was making it. But I'm an electrician. I go into crawl spaces for a living. I told myself it was no different than checking for a bad ground wire. I waited for a dry afternoon, pried the loose lattice section free with a flathead screwdriver, and got down on my stomach with a flashlight. It was mostly what you'd expect. Dirt, old spider webs, a rusted coffee can, a few decades of leaves blown in through gaps. But about 8 feet in, up against the foundation, there was a shape that didn't belong. A wooden box about the size of a large shoebox, swollen with moisture, half sunk into the dirt, like it had been there long enough for the ground to start reclaiming it. I dragged it out. The wood was soft and split along one seam, and when I pried it open with a screwdriver, the smell that came out was mildew and something sweeter underneath that I didn't want to think too hard about. Inside was a girl's diary, the kind with a little brass clasp, the lock long since rusted through, the pages swollen and stuck together in places, but mostly legible. There was also a small collection of things that made my stomach turn once I understood what I was looking at. A hair ribbon, a class photo gone soft with water damage, a house key on a piece of twine, and a folded newspaper clipping. I took the box inside, which in hindsight was the second stupid decision of the day, because it meant I spent that whole evening reading. The diary belonged to a girl named Carol. The entries were dated across a span of about 8 months. The last one dated in October, no year given on that particular page, but an earlier entry mentioned turning 16, and the handwriting had that specific loopy, self-conscious quality of a teenager who knows someone might read it someday and is performing a little for that imagined reader. Most of it was ordinary. Complaints about a boy named Dale who didn't call when he said he would, a fight with her mother about curfew, a section where she wrote pages and pages about wanting to leave the hollow the second she turned 18, how her mother never let her out of sight, how her mother would stand on her porch and watch her walk all the way down the road to the bus stop every single morning like she thought Carol would vanish the second she was out of view. The last entries got darker. She wrote about her mother going through her things, about a lock that kept getting picked, about feeling watched even inside her own room. The very last entry, the one dated in October, read something like this, and I'm paraphrasing loosely because the ink had run in places. She was planning to leave that night during a storm because the storm would cover the sound of her climbing out her window, and because she knew her mother hated getting wet and wouldn't come out looking until morning. That was the last entry. There was nothing after it. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the newspaper clipping and finally made myself unfold it. It was a short piece, maybe 4 inches of column space, about a local girl reported missing after a storm in October of that unspecified year. Last seen leaving her home on foot, presumed to have run away, case still open. Anyone with information asked to contact the county sheriff. There was no follow-up clipping in the box, no resolution. Just that one brittle scrap of newspaper that apparently had been enough to answer the question for whoever buried this box, and not enough to answer it for me. Here's where I have to tell you the part I still don't have an explanation for, and where I'll understand if you stop believing me, because I don't fully believe myself. That night, it started raining again. Hard. The kind of rain that sounds like static on the roof. I hadn't slept in the box's presence. I'd left it on my kitchen table, and I told myself I was going to drive it into town in the morning and hand it over to the sheriff's office. Let them decide what an old cold case file wanted with a rotted diary under my porch. At around 11, that same internal alarm went off, and I looked out my window, and Mrs. Auberly was standing at the bottom of my steps again, except this time she wasn't looking up at my window. She was looking at the kitchen window, at the table, at the box. I don't know how she could have known it was there. I hadn't told anyone but Robbie over the phone, hours after I had already dug it up, and even then I hadn't described what was in it. But she stood there in the downpour with her raincoat hood down, hair plastered flat, and stared at that box through my glass like she could see straight through the wall. And for the first time since I'd moved in, she spoke. I couldn't make out words through the rain and the window, just the shape of her mouth moving, over and over, the same short phrase. And something about watching an old woman mouth silent words at my kitchen table in the middle of the night broke something loose in me that all the earlier stuff hadn't quite managed to. I did not go outside. I want that on record. I turned off every light in the house. I sat on my kitchen floor below the window line with my phone in my hand. And I did not call anyone because I genuinely did not know what I would say. Come get an elderly woman off my porch for standing in the rain isn't a crime anyone comes out for at midnight in a county with one deputy on shift. She stayed out there for almost 2 hours. I know because I watched the clock the entire time. And at some point past 1 in the morning, I heard, very faintly under the rain, the sound of the porch steps creaking, one at a time, slow, like someone climbing them carefully in the dark. I did not go look. I sat with my back against the cabinets and I listened to those steps stop right outside my kitchen door, and I listened to nothing at all for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes. And then I heard the steps going back down, and I did not move until it was light outside. When the sun came up, I checked the door. It was still locked. There was no sign anyone had touched it. No mud, no scratches, nothing. The box was still on the table exactly where I'd left it. I checked the porch, the yard, the tree line, nothing. If it weren't for the fact that Cooper's grave marker, a little wooden cross I'd made myself, had been moved about a foot to the left and turned to face the house instead of the road, I might have convinced myself the whole night had been a stress dream brought on by finding a dead girl's diary in a box under my porch. I packed the bag that morning. I called Robbie's aunt and told her I was breaking the lease, that I'd forfeit the deposit, I didn't care, I needed to be somewhere else that week. I took the box with me, drove it straight to the county sheriff's office 2 towns over, and told a very patient deputy a heavily edited version of the story, mostly the part about finding it under a rental house, leaving out the part about a woman standing in my kitchen window mouthing words at me through the glass, because I already knew how that would sound. The deputy took my statement and told me the case number would be pulled up and reviewed. that these old missing person files never fully close, that they'd be in touch if they needed anything else from me. I gave them my new address, a motel across the county line, and I never heard back. I looked up the case myself once, about a month later, using the county's public record search. The file was still listed as open. No new updates. No mention of a diary being logged as evidence, though I have no way of knowing if that's because it wasn't relevant or because it never made it into the file at all. I never went back to that house. Robbie texted me a few weeks later, said his aunt had a hard time renting it out again, said the Auberly place looked off from the road now, shutters closed permanently, no lights ever on, and that a couple of the neighbors down the hollow mentioned they hadn't seen Betty Ann out at all anymore, rain or shine, which everyone took as a sign she'd finally passed, quietly, the way old women out in the hollow sometimes do without anybody noticing for a while. I moved back into town, took an apartment with actual neighbors on the other side of a shared wall, and haven't had a dog since, which I know isn't really connected to anything, but I can't bring myself to get another one yet. I think about that last diary entry a lot, about a girl who wanted to leave during a storm because she knew her mother wouldn't follow her out into the rain. I think about the fact that whoever buried that box chose to bury it rather than burn it or throw it in the river, chose to keep it close, under the floor of a house that wasn't even built yet when the girl went missing, if the newspaper clippings' date lines line up the way I think it does, which would mean somebody moved that box from wherever it originally was and reburied it under my porch specifically, decades later, deliberately. I don't have a neat ending for you. I don't know what happened to Carol Auberly in October of whatever year it was. I don't know if her mother did something to her and has spent 40-some years going out into every storm since, looking for a body she already knows the location of, or if her mother genuinely believes she's still out there somewhere, still 16, still able to be found if the search goes on long enough. I don't know why an old woman would stand in freezing rain to stare through a stranger's window at a box of her missing daughter's things, or what those silent words were that she kept mouthing at the glass. All I know is that it doesn't rain anymore without me checking every lock in my apartment twice, and that some nights, right around 11, I still catch myself glancing toward the window before I remember there's nothing outside it but a parking lot and a streetlight, and I still don't feel entirely reassured by that.